Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Lance Hornby. Lance is a hockey writer at the Toronto Sun and a graduate of my school, Centennial College. In this episode, I chat with Lance about joining the Sun those many years ago, how covering the Toronto Maple Leafs has changed over the years, as well as writing a book about the history of Toronto's beloved hockey team. We are at episode 20 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, and I just want to say thank you for everyone who has watched, liked, rated, and subscribed to this podcast. But as we keep going forward, make sure to like, rate, subscribe, and watch on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Now let's enjoy episode 20 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Lance Hornby. He is a hockey writer for the Toronto Sun. Lance, thanks so much for joining me on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. How are you?
Oh, very good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure, and Lance, you and I both attended the same school at very different times, Centennial College. We'll get into that, but I wanted to ask you because, you've been doing, of course, a lot of hockey reporting recently, and one area of hockey is about women's hockey and the new Toronto NWHL franchise, the Toronto Six. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on the news that a women's hockey franchise is coming back to Toronto.
Well, a couple of things there. Obviously, it's interesting that the Maple Leafs had an investment in the last team in the Canadian Women's League, a team that was there, and I'm sure they had big plans for that. Of course, that went by the boards when the league decided that they wanted to, have a paying, a pay scale, and who can blame them, right? They've been, underserved in that area. You gotta tip your hat to these ladies for launching a new league in the middle of a pandemic, including a new team in Toronto. They don't have a place to play yet, so that's the first thing people have asked me. Something I'm going to get into in the next little while if they don't announce it themselves. But that's the big thing. Some of these players, I mean, a lot of women's players aren't household names anyway, at least the ones who've moved on since the success of the Canadian Olympic team. I know some of them, but the age of the Haley Wickenheisers and Sammy Jo Smalls and all that, they've kind of moved on. So I'm not that familiar with the new ones, and they announce signings every day. And I can't say I've heard a lot of these players, but certainly wish them luck. And I live in a residential area of Toronto called Riverdale that has a huge ball hockey presence. And my son went to school with a couple of girls who were very big into hockey. And I think it's wonderful that might give these kids an outlet and maybe an affordable, they're always looking for different forms of entertainment, and maybe this might be something that family can get into. I'm going to guess it's affordable depending on what arena they wind up in. So best of luck to them, but I think it's going to be quite difficult to launch, as I said, and with all this going on in the world today.
No, for sure. And of course, for all leagues right now, they're trying to figure out, the NHL, of course, figured out how to restart their season. But for some leagues, like the AHL, they canceled the 2019-20 season. And you've spent a lot of time covering the Toronto Marlies. And the last few years have been very successful for the Marlies. But this season, they probably weren't going to make the playoffs. Of course, when Sheldon Keefe got promoted to the Maple Leafs, Greg Moore came in as the head coach for the Marlies. I'm curious how you would characterize this Marlies season and whether any of the current Marlies players you think, could help make the Leafs down the road.
Well, I think they're a victim of their own success in many ways. That most of their best players came up and joined the Leafs right away. And it was quite interesting that at one point they had Rasmus Sandin, and Timothy Liljegren with them at the same time. You mentioned me covering them for a little while. These are feel-good stories. A guy like Pierre Engvall, who was really trying hard to make the team. You wondered, was he ever going to get his chance? Mason Marchment might have been another guy had he not been hurt as much as he was. And despite the fact Garrett Sparks didn't play well in his when he got the chance at the NHL, that was another guy who really put in his time down in the minors. So this year's Marlies unfortunately didn't have a lot of success because some of their players were up. They had some injuries to switch to a new coach. It's a very good Ottawa team in their division, the Belleville Senators, who are probably, I see they had 2 or 3 guys on the All-Star team, so they were ready to move. So your point is a good one. It looked like for the first time after almost guaranteeing they'd go 2 or 3 rounds, they weren't going to make it by all signs. So it'll be interesting to see that they say there's a silver lining to things, maybe not making the playoffs, maybe getting their act together next year, and they may wind up with a couple of players at the least we're looking at who may not make it in camp next year. Marlies, I think, will always be interesting because Toronto loves to carry veteran players, and if they find the right fit, like Garrett Wilson, guys like that who went down, it's usually a good situation for them, and they love to play here versus I don't know. I'll probably get flack from this if you have any listeners in Chicago, but we'll say whatever, Rockford, Oklahoma City. It's if you're a Canadian kid, playing for the Marlies is like playing for the 32nd NHL team.
No, for sure. And I think luckily for you, Lance, most of my listeners are from the Toronto area, so they'll really appreciate those words. But I want to get into your sports journalism career. And like I said off the top, both of us attended Centennial College. You went there in 1981, many, many years ago. But I'm just curious from you growing up, were you always interested in becoming a sports journalist?
Well, first of all, at one time when I was at Centennial, I had hair just like you before it went all white. This is what
that's what covering the Leafs does to you, Lance.
Covering the Leafs for 30 years turned me into a snow-capped mountain peak here. But you know what? It was interesting. The Centennial back then was much, much different, and really the whole journalism field, as far as school went, was different. I mean, it's the one business where you have to get experience in the field. That's still the key. That's probably the one thread that keeps going on. And I did learn a lot from the teachers there, and it was a wonderful place to to learn the basics, to make friends, to drink, and do all kinds of neat things. But the good thing for me there was getting the experience to work first at the school paper and then also at the radio station there. So that was a good grounding. That's something I can't emphasize enough to any aspiring journalists out there. There's obviously not as many jobs as when I started, and everyone likes sports. So just to get back to your first question, everybody dreams about covering it, but there's it's more important now than ever to make your mark a different way in different niches of social media. And it's my hat's off to a lot of the kids who are coming out of school and trying different ways, but getting back to some basic tenets of what you have to do. You can't be afraid of hard work, and you can't be afraid to say no to the to working in long hours and maybe unglamorous assignments. A colleague of mine, Brad Hunter at the Sun, was just talking about this in today's paper, I think, when he said he used to work at the New York Post, and he said the rule of thumb there was that you're never too important not to cover a fire in Queens. And I guess that's where you got to think about it. You're never important enough not to go and cover a high school game or a college game. And that's where I met a lot of people, learned how, made mistakes on the job and learned from them, moved on, and fortunately covering some junior hockey, and that got to meet people in the game today who've grown up as I have, and a lot of them are in influential jobs and have turned out to be pretty good sources over the years.
And I imagine that when you were at Centennial, the focus was a lot on print journalism, because back then, print journalism was the dominant medium of disseminating information, unlike today where when I'm at Centennial, you're learning about writing, broadcasting, photography, video production, social media.
Yeah. And sometimes you do all those in the same day.
Of course.
And that's something that it's been interesting to watch that at the Toronto Sun, where, I've gone from being, some of that early stuff that you talked about to being the so-called multimedia journalist, learning how to, write stories on a phone in the middle of a crowded subway car or a bus on the way to Lakeshore Lions Arena or Ford Performance Center, wherever they're practicing, or, in an airport, or all kinds of, it's been all kinds of adventures that way, but you have to adapt with the technology and the way things are done. It's like night and day right now, but the basic tenets are still there. You have to get something, something legible, something, something that's well written, that is grammatically correct. Although that's one of the challenges these days with the lack of copy editors going on. But you still have to get stuff out there. People want the news and they want it like that, and that's the sometimes toughest part. But that's also part of the thrill of the hunt as well.
So how do you end up going from Centennial to the Toronto Sun?
Well, very lucky. I did my placement there. We started out with about 32 people in our class at Centennial, and it was kind of a changing of the guard there. And we had a guy named John Watt who came on in the second and third year. John's now covering baseball for the National Post, and John made a very big difference in the program the last couple of years. And I got my own placement at the Sun, to answer your question, and got very fortunate, because as a Toronto kid, to work at a Toronto paper was an incredible break. And outside of working at the Star for a few weeks in 1981, I've been there ever since, and had a wonderful time, and been very fortunate to work in various capacities in various sports, cover some Jays, Argonauts, soccer. I was a high school writer for a few years, the junior hockey writer, the college guy, and came on the Leafs in 1986. And I've stayed there, maybe too long for some of the readers out there who've disagreed with my stuff over the years, but it's been quite a ride. And the big thing, of course, is that the Leafs are a big deal in Toronto. They all, win, lose, or draw, they're always news. And I feel fortunate to be part of a team of writers here, and cover a beat that so many people care about. And it goes back, team goes back 100 years. I love the history of it. I've written several books on the topic and that. So it's been pretty good. I've been very, very fortunate. And, I hope I can hang in. It's, a few more years. It's a very volatile time in the business. I'm sure you've been told that, and everybody realizes that. And, hopefully we all find a way to get along. And I'm sure there's bright young people such as yourself coming up behind us to carry the torch.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, and you're actually my second Toronto Sun writer to come on the show, the first being Bob Elliott, who said on this show that you were the one that convinced him to write the book If the Walls Could Talk About Baseball with the Blue Jays. So my question is, like, who are some of the characters that you worked with, and are any of the fellow writers that you worked with in sports still at the Sun today?
I'm let me think now. I think I'm probably the oldest in sports in terms of continuous service. I started in 81, as you said, and at Centennial in 78 with that class. Now there's older people at the Sun who've a couple of day wonders, so like Andy Donato, who's been there, and Rita DeMontis has been there many years. But it's I've been there a long time. Getting some of the people I've worked with there have moved on to other things. Journalism is that kind of thing. There are other papers, or they've moved on. Like Bob Elliott, for example, great Hall of Fame writer, the first Canadian writer at Cooperstown, and I'm glad he gave me a shout out there. And I was very lucky. The guy ahead of me at the Sun was Scott Morrison, who was also at Centennial. Scott was the sports editor of the paper. I came on as his writer at Centennial. He left. I became sports editor. He went to the Sun. I went to the Sun to cover his old beat at high school when he moved up to college, and I kind of followed him all the way along to the point where he was the NHL columnist and I was the Leaf columnist. So it's another big name there, and another great Centennial connection. But some of the guys are still around. It's quite funny now that I'm the age now where a lot of the young guys are or breaking in. When I broke in, there was Frank Orr and Trent Frayne, and a lot of the legends were there when I was the kid. And it's funny, I'm not in their, I don't put myself in their class at all, but I'm the same age as them when these young guys are coming up, and when they ask questions about what it was like in the old days. Makes me feel my gray hair, but also I'm grateful that they would think of me like that as the veteran of the beat. And one of these days we might all have a Stanley Cup to write about.
Well, here's hoping. But you mentioned about covering high school sports as well as junior hockey, and I find that for a lot of young writers and reporters, having those beats is very important because, you get to, like you said, make mistakes, but also learn the ropes of the industry. Unfortunately, for something like high school sports, it's definitely not covered as much as I believe it should. I had the chance to cover some high school basketball earlier this year as part of my responsibilities with Centennial. I'm just curious, what you remember from your days covering high school sports, because even today, it's so exciting, to be able to go into a high school gym and just see the community come together to support their team.
I loved high school sports, and there was a time when it was a very high-profile beat at the papers. I went up against a guy named Neil Campbell at the Globe and David Grossman at the Star. This obviously before the National Post came along, and the Scarborough Mirror and the Etobicoke Guardian were also big on that. And I spent the better part of my life on the buses. I don't drive, and that's one thing I've been able to somehow keep my job despite the fact I don't drive. But I learned every bus route in Toronto and where every high school and junior high was in public school, because I did a lot of that as well. So if nothing else, I got a great education on the TTC. But going back to what you were saying, it was great. I mean, the kids loved you. It was I did high school rankings and for basketball and hockey, and you just got such genuine appreciation for what they were going through, and later on, certainly when you cover a lot of pro athletes, I still enjoy talking to hockey players, I should say, but you saw a lot of prima donna behavior in baseball, football, basketball, some hockey, I guess, but I'll always treasure those days because it was so innocent. The kids, they couldn't wait to talk to you, and they were so happy you were there, and you got to be quite popular with them. And many nights on the phone, we used to have to, at the end of the night, after writing all this high school stuff during the day, you had to take the scores at night. So these, for 12-year-old kids were phoning in for $2 a score, I remember, and, telling you whatever Michael Power had beaten St. Michael's in football and who the touchdowns were, and I had to keep track of all those and pay them. It was something, but it was a great training, and I certainly treasure those days and wish that we still had a high school presence. Now, of course, the world has very much changed, but I sense certainly probably high school basketball, certainly since the Raptors have taken off, is still big. Football got too expensive, but a lot of the kids I covered in track, some of them went on to cover, like Milt Audie and all that, went on to become Canadian Olympians. And I still bump into people who were those athletes from those days. And anytime I bump into somebody from Toronto, a great icebreaker is, what high school did you go to? Because I probably know somebody that was their teacher who was also their coach. So it was a great experience.
No, for sure. Shifting gears now to covering the Toronto Maple Leafs, and you wrote a book a couple years back about celebrating the Leafs' 100-year history, Toronto and its Maple Leafs, the city and its team. And I'm just curious, when writing that book, as someone that grew up following the Leafs and knowing a lot about this team, was there a story or a nugget that you researched that you did not know when you wrote that book, or did everything that you write about in that book you knew about or you reported on?
Well, I'm a closet historian, so I've always loved the subject of history, and I love the subject of Toronto history. And that book was a real labor of love for me. I went back and, I'm most fascinated about Maple Leaf Gardens, a place that I went to many times as a kid. still remember the first time my brother had bought me there, and the stories that people had about not just the Leafs, but the fact it was where the Marlies and wrestling and rock concerts and all that kind of thing. You know, all the different parts of that building that was the largest gathering place in Canada for decades, you know, where a lot of famous political speeches happened and all that. So I was quite thrilled to be able to cover that, and you know, anything to do with Harold Ballard was a funny story. So I could sit here for hours and talk to you about how weird that was, because I had just come on the beat in the last years of the Ballard reign. And it was just chaos from the moment you went in the door to when you left. But I was very lucky. I got to know Bob and Gord Stellick, Bob being the PR man for the Leafs, and Gordy being the assistant general manager, and then the general manager itself. I virtually had the run of Maple Leaf Gardens to do all those great, you know, talk to everyone from the Zamboni driver to Paul Morris, the often imitated announcer of the goals and assists there. So I had a great, it was a great window on the world of the Leafs, of the concerts, of whatever, the Beatles, Elvis Presley, all that kind of thing. I was very fortunate to have a window into that.
And it's interesting that you actually start the book talking about Maple Leaf Gardens, and you know, now of course Maple Leaf Gardens, there's still a rink there, but it's for Ryerson University. There's also a grocery store there now, Loblaws. Yeah. But you know, compared to Scotiabank Arena, you know, which has, you know, it's bigger and it has more of a corporate feel, I always find Maple Leaf Gardens like there's a little bit of an edge to it, given, you know, where it is at the corner of Church and Carlton. It's right, you know, it has a very Toronto feel to it. And I'm just curious for you, having the opportunity to cover so many Leafs teams in this historic cathedral.
Well, I had a chance to go to you know, to look into the fact that it was an arena that was, nobody wanted it at the time. First of all, they didn't want to build it in the middle of the Depression. There's a beach store that's over there where the Winners is now, at College Young, and they didn't want a hockey rink anywhere near there because they thought it was the wrong clientele to be attracting over there. But it was you know, the Maple Leaf, few people know the Maple Leafs were about to leave. They were going to get bought by Interest in Philadelphia and moved because the Toronto St. Patrick's were losing money at Mutual Street Arena, and they wanted them, you know, one of the ideas was to buy them and get them out of town. So it was pretty cool that it got to stay there. And I am glad that they were able to produce or to save the rink. It's obviously not the same, but I was just talking about this to somebody the other day, doing a piece on fans, how at Maple Leaf Gardens, you know, everybody, if you got up to go to the bathroom, you had to go by the players to squeeze through and then go out to the, you know, out to the bathroom. And, you know, you know, there's no glass behind the bench. And, I mean, it was, you know, I mean, the Hockey Night in Canada studio was this, it looked so magnificent on television. But if you got to go there, like I did, it was across from the Maple Leaf dressing room, and it was like a broom closet that they fixed up with nice lighting, and you know, where Don Cherry and Ron McLean were. So it was a great chance to see that area, and you know, they built it to last, and it's I believe it's the last of the original 6 arenas still being used for something. You know, we mentioned the grocery store, aisle 25. If anyone's ever interested, where they keep the international spices, that's where the face-off dot is. Wow. It's preserved on the floor there if you want to go and take a picture. And they see people grab cans of tuna and pretend to drop a puck there still. So and they left some of the walls exposed and that kind of thing. But I remember, again, the Gardens is more than just the Leafs. It's a huge part of Toronto history, and I'm glad they've saved it. You've probably given me idea. I think I think next year is probably 80 years, I think, since it was built. So from back to 1931. So whatever that anniversary is, you've just given me a good idea, maybe to touch base and write another feature on it.
Oh, well, looking forward to reading it and getting 10% for that idea. But just kidding. I want to talk about a couple Leafs teams that that you've covered, and they've of course been the subject of some of reruns right now on various TV networks during the pandemic. The first being the 1993 Leafs, which of course had a real epic playoff run, and you know, watching some of those old games like Nikolai Borchevsky's Game 7 OT winner against Detroit, or Doug Gilmour's OT goal against St. Louis. You know, those were amazing Leafs moments, but like they happened during a pre-social media era. Like I can't even imagine, you know, those goals happening in today's generation, considering how passionate Leafs Twitter is. So I'm just curious what it was like to, you know, cover those moments, you know, because they were really special.
It was crazy. First of all, they played, they were the first team to play 3 straight 7-game series, and they didn't take a day off. So that was 21 games times 42. So 21 times 2, I think, is 42. So that was 42 straight days of work there. I think we didn't take a day off 2 weeks before that playoff started because it was a big deal. They were back in because they'd missed the previous couple of years. And of course, there was about a week's worth of stories afterwards because they'd come so close. But yeah, being there was unbelievable. I mean, the whole thing. There was a controversy about Wendell Clark not wanting to fight Joey Kosher, his cousin, in the first series against Detroit. Then you get to the press box in Detroit in Game 7, and Cliff Fletcher's just like a caged tiger walking around before that overtime goal, and then it gets scored. And Joe Bowen was telling me later that he saw Borchevsky tip it because I think when they changed ends, they got closer to Joe's spot. So Joe saw it, and Bob Cole, who called it, didn't quite see Borchevsky tip it. So Joe was always proud of that little nugget that he'd actually seen who scored it. And the St. Louis goal, the double OT goal that Gilmour had on the wraparound in Game 1. Remember, that's only 48 hours after the Borchevsky goal put all of Leaf Nation, into orbit. You see. The minute he scores, you'll see the camera jiggle, and that's because, again, an interesting point of the Gardens is that camera was sitting really right among the fans. So when you see that jiggle there, that means 3 fans got up and bumped the camera as it was filming Gilmour, just another one of those small little Gardens tidbits. And, of course, everybody wishes it could have gone a little further. A small story, Game 6 in L.A., the Gilmour game with the high stick, myself and Paul Hunter of the Star were in the crowd because that's where the press box was. There was no press box at Great Western Forum. You had to be in the stands with the fans, and it was quite uncomfortable because you were crowded and they were like really looking over your shoulder, kind of thing. So we said, let's go to the press room and write in the third period because we had to send stories right away for deadline. Get in there. All we know is, we're just kind of typing madly, looking at the screen. Anyway, all we know is that LA has won in overtime. So we go running into the press room, and somebody walks in and says, hey, you cover the high stick, and I'll cover the rest of the game. And Paul Hunter and I looked at each other like, what high stick? We didn't. Neither of us, who at that time and still were the oldest Leaf beat writers around for the 20-something years, and the most controversial play since 1967. Both of us missed it. We had no idea what had happened. So that was always a funny story. And it would have been neat if they could have won. We had a special edition of The Sun that had a cover, here come the Canadians, the Stanley Cup final. I still have the company ticket for Game 1 of the Stanley Cup final that says Toronto versus opponent because they didn't know who was going to win. So that's a keeper for me. But that was quite a year.
And I'm just curious, Lance, like how many reporters from the Sun would be sent to, let's say, Detroit or to St. Louis to cover or LA to cover those series?
Well, money was no object in those days, at least 4 or 5. The most I've ever seen at one event, I think, was the Jays playoff in Oakland around '89. I think we had about 15 altogether, if you count city side, all the sports reporters, all the news side people, all the photographers. We had about 15, and now I think last year in Boston, owing with costs and everything, we had 3. So it shows you, I think the Star had 2 or 3. The Globe won. I think the National Post didn't even go. So that's just to give you a little illustration about what's going on. Now, if they get to the Stanley Cup final, all bets are off. Or you're going to be at 747, I think, to just bring in the Toronto media for a road game if they get that far.
And yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, like, it just shows you, just the changes all across the industry. But, at least with the Toronto Sun, like, at least you guys, definitely send reporters, not just to Toronto sports events, but other events like, the Super Bowl, for example. So there's definitely an emphasis on, sports
Oh,
reporting. But
yeah.
another Leafs team I want to, ask you about is the 2002 Leafs. And this is one of the first teams that I remember watching because, there were so many stars like Matt Sundin and Alexander McGillney and Curtis Joseph and net. And this is a team
Gary
again
Roberts.
Gary Roberts. And, this is a team that, again, got to the conference final, but just fell short to the Carolina Hurricanes. And again, it just felt like this team had the talent, but just couldn't get quite over the hump.
Yeah. You know what? Carolina was a very, very frustrating team to play against. I think Paul Maurice was the coach back then, if I'm not mistaken. So that was a pretty good series. I use that series all the time when, as an example, when people say, well, the Leafs don't care about winning, or they're just a corporate, they're a corporate entity, and it's and that's whenever I hear that, I understand where the frustration's coming from. But that is a team that I look to and say, you know what? If I had gone to Gary Roberts 3 series in, and he's held together with glue and chicken wire, and a lot of guys are all banged up, and they're if I'd gone up to him and said, what are you bothering for? At least never win anything. He would have decked me, and I would not have blamed him at all. Done that because that was a team I think that was one of the most spirited teams. As much as Doug Gilmour sort of carried the '93 Leafs, that team had a real character about it. And of course, remember Sundin was injured for part of the time, and his lieutenants, like Roberts, like McCabe, like Alan McCauley, they really came to the forefront then. And I thought that was a fun team to cover. Again, like you say, just came up a little short, and that would have been a pretty good final, but I think their best chance might have been in '99 too. I don't know if you get around to that team. That was a club that, remember Dominic Hasek missed the first 2 games of the conference final in goal for Buffalo, and the Leafs couldn't beat Dwayne Rollison in game 1. That was a great chance to go up 2-0, and I guess they would have played Dallas in the final. But that was another team, much like the Burns team, sort of came out of nowhere. They'd missed the playoffs the first couple of years. I really thought that club had a chance to go far as well.
Lance, you've been covering the Leafs since 1986, and today, of course, covering sports has changed so much since when you first started covering hockey. I'm just curious what the challenges are today as a beat reporter covering hockey. Let's leave the pandemic out of the picture for a moment, and let's just assume we're in a normal circumstances covering a season. I mean, what are the challenges covering the Leafs now compared to 1986?
It starts with the letter A, access. We don't have the access we once did, and therefore we don't have a lot of the good one-on-one stories that we get. We still get them, but it takes a lot of, it takes a lot more guile. It takes, it takes a lot more talking to other people. There was a time where you could just go right in, and the guy was getting dressed. You sit there and talk, and that was, you got everything. You got everything you needed. Right now, it's a lot of players are brought out to a larger. They come out of a separate dressing area. They talk in front of about 25 people, and it's much more difficult to get one-on-ones. And certainly travel, I guess, is another aspect of that. There's it's much harder to get A to B, especially since 9/11. It's difficult to travel and get there. And some papers have cut back, so some papers are covering the team from home, and I really hope that doesn't become the norm. We're still lucky at the Sun; we get to go on the road and cover them. But that's that's another thing you miss that personal. You miss that personal touch, and the NHL is far more involved in player, in player access. They love to control it, and you're not getting that same access. You're not getting, you're not getting the off the cuff stuff, and you don't get, backup goalies and fighters, and fourth liners that's how I made my career, essentially, talking to those guys, because they were the great quotes in the dressing room, most often the most analytical guys as well, and a lot of them have survived now to work in television. But when you miss that sort of thing, and you miss traveling with the team, I guess that's another big aspect too. When you're with them, you don't report everything that goes on, but at least you have a better perspective. If you know why a certain thing happened, or you have a different you have a different perspective of it because you're with them, you know them, and those are some of the differences between now and the 1990s. Not to say it isn't fun now, but it's just different. And a lot of the younger kids come to me and they say, you had that, you went into the dressing room, he told you that, and all that kind of stuff. So it's that's when you really appreciate a bygone era.
And you mentioned about, talking to fourth liners and backup goalies. And I think for a lot of journalists, sometimes, they're like, okay, I have to talk to Austin Matthews or Mitch Marner, the people that a lot of people obviously, gravitate to for quotes. But finding those little nuggets often lead to much better stories. And I guess in a media market like Toronto, where there's so many journalists and reporters covering this team, you got to find ways to stand out. And I'm just curious for you, Lance, you've been covering the team for a while now. There's a lot of, younger reporters now on the beat. I'm just curious how you stand out all these years later after covering the team starting in 1986.
Well, it's a lot of different things. I mean, I do appreciate, that there's a lot of hungry young reporters out there, and they do a lot of, we have a, he's not that young anymore, but Terry Koshin at our place, he went through junior hockey covering that for 10 years. So he's got a great grounding in the game. So he knows far more about the technical aspects of it than maybe I do, salary cap, that kind of thing. Because a lot of people have now, we're in the since the salary cap came in, it's been a different way of looking at the game. And I think that's important. But I also feel that I represent an older generation who likes to hear about the, more about the history of the game, certainly about the Leafs and the, so to put a lot of that, covering Austin Matthews is great, but I want to know, what does Rick Vaive think? Rick Vaive scored 50 goals, right? So, how does that how does that stack up to what Austin Matthews is doing right now? And, this is, if the Leafs get 2 or 3 rounds, you just talked to me about the older playoff teams, and that be great to do a comparison with those guys. Maybe talk to a Gilmore or Roberts and see what they're going through. And I'm very lucky that the Leafs have been around since 1917. So there's a lot of people who remember, certainly remember the 60s and the 4 Stanley Cups and that kind of thing. So whenever I can, I try and get stuff in there, because I find out, I find that still resonates with a lot of people, especially with no Stanley Cups since then. People, and everyone says, well, why you can't live in the past all the time, but that was a big part of Toronto hockey history, and I like to bring that up whenever I can. And it's you have to talk to Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner. They get the clicks, certainly, but you also want to talk to everybody on the team as you can. Like I mentioned, Pierre Engvall. I like still talking to the lesser guys like that, or a really good quote such as Travis Dermott. People like that. Jack Campbell is a good one coming in now. Jake Muzzin, people like that. They're very interesting players to talk to.
You mentioned about getting the clicks, and I think that's what a lot of digital media entities now are very focused on, and rightfully so, because, trying to get traffic is very important. But at the Sun, I mean, which is, a print company, but also, has a digital side. Is that what you focus on, or are you just, when you're pitching, a story to the editor, are you just, saying to yourself, let's just find the best story and the clicks and the eyeballs will take care of itself?
Yeah. That's a good way. It's a great way to put it. I've sort of prided myself, and other people at our paper do too, on, finding something that's off the, off the beaten path. There's still, if you let it happen, it's a very predictable way. We won, we lost, we got to learn from this and move on. And Austin Matthews will say this, and the other coach will say that, and Mitch Marner will say that. Frederick Anderson will mumble something. He's not the most vocal guy around. But you got to look for different stuff, records that are coming up, the opponent, that they're going to play. Do they have a relationship? There's maybe a Leaf was traded there. Maybe teams that come into town, I find are very, very interesting too, because especially in this day and age, they don't have a lot of reporters traveling with them. When Carolina came in and David Ayers set that record, there was no Carolina beat reporter there. They put David Ayers. They said local media first of all, and there was like a guy with a handheld phone. I think he was their electronic media guy. There was no writer, and then they let the Toronto media talk to him, and there were like 15 of us. So it's just kind of an illustration of what goes on as far as that's concerned.
Last question for you, Lance, and it has to do with, because you talked about Toronto history and those 4 Stanley Cups that the Leafs won in the 60s, and we're approaching the 1-year anniversary of the Toronto Raptors winning the NBA championship, and that was a moment that really united an entire country in terms of the Raptors in basketball. I know if the Leafs win the Stanley Cup, there will be parts of the country that may not like the Leafs winning the Cup, Montreal, or don't care about the Leafs winning the Stanley Cup. But just focusing on the city of Toronto itself, do you think the celebration will be equal or even greater than the Raptors celebration was if the Leafs win the Cup?
I wrote a column on this. I was not in Toronto when they actually won. I was just coming back from a vacation in Italy, but I came back and covered the parade, and that was my angle. Would a Leafs parade be bigger? And I was very, very impressed by what there were obviously. You saw the follow-up stories. It got to the danger point. There were too many people there. Everyone says, well, like even you heard this many times before when the Argos would win, and there'd be a few people coming up and say, oh yeah. Wait till the Leafs win the Cup. Well, I can't imagine a parade being bigger, although somebody pointed out to me, they said, if the Leafs ever won the Cup, there would be so many people from outside Toronto who have a stake in the Leafs. But, the total opposite of the Raptors, who have a big following here. People would fly in from the United States. It'd be like the Chicago Cubs winning the World Series. People would fly in from the West, from Newfoundland, from wherever, maybe from Europe, just to be in that parade. So we'll have to see what happens. And as a colleague of mine pointed out the other day, it would be a funny year for the Leafs to win this year because there would be no parade.
That would be so Toronto Maple Leafs.
Going down an empty Bay Street.
Yeah, that would be so Toronto Maple Leafs.
That would be par for the course.
Yeah, in the year where an emergency goalie beat the Toronto Maple Leafs, they also win the Cup where there's no fans and no parade. Lance Hornby, he is a hockey writer for the Toronto Sun. Lance, thank you so much for joining me today on the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Okay, thanks for having me. Great questions.